Please don't take the cloth off, she begged. But the mountain man did, and was shattered. In the dead of a Colorado winter, a lone mountain man drags a half-frozen woman into his cabin. She clutches a rough wool cloth to her chest, begging him to leave it alone. But when he tears it away, the firelight reveals a secret so shocking it stops him cold, an infant gasping for breath. He thought he was saving one life. Instead, he's thrust into a battle for 3 souls, his, hers, and the child's. Snowdrifts rise outside, rifles wait in town, and whispers of a forbidden marriage spread like wildfire. As the cabin door shudders under the knock of angry men, he realizes the truth he uncovered may cost them everything. Will he find the courage to shield them against a town set on vengeance? Or will the secret beneath that cloth destroy them all? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The wind howled like a hungry wolf around Grady Boone's mountain shack as he trudged the final steps toward home. Snow pelted his face, the late afternoon light fading fast behind thick gray clouds. His leather boots crunched through the fresh powder, leaving deep tracks that the storm would soon erase. The day's catch hung heavy from his shoulder, 2 rabbits and a fox that would fetch fair prices come spring, assuming he lived through this bitter winter. Something caught his eye near the creek, a dark shape against all that white. At first he reckoned it was just another snow-covered log, but something didn't sit right. Grady changed course, moving careful-like toward the creek bank. The shape resolved itself into something that made his heart skip, a human form, half buried in the driving snow. A rough wool cloth wrapped the figure, now crusted with ice. Grady's joints protested as he knelt beside the body, his calloused hand reaching out to brush away snow from what he could now see was a woman's face. Her skin was dark, marked by the high cheekbones and strong features of the Apache people. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, checking for signs of life. A faint warmth still clung to her skin, and he could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest beneath the cloth. She lived, but barely. Without hesitation, Grady scooped her up in his arms. The cloth wrapped around her was coarse and frozen stiff, but he didn't dare remove it out here in the killing cold. The woman weighed little more than a child herself, and he cradled her close as he made his way back to the cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low. Grady laid her as gentle as he could manage on the braided rug near the hearth, then quickly built up the flames with fresh logs and kindling. The warm light filled the one-room cabin, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. As heat from the fire began to reach her, the woman's eyes fluttered open, dark eyes, filled with fear and something else. Desperation, maybe. Her cracked lips moved, forming words that came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please," she managed, her voice rough as pine bark. "Don't take the cloth off." Grady stood back, unsure what to make of her words. In all his years alone in these mountains, he'd never faced a situation quite like this. The woman clearly needed help, but that plea gave him pause. What secret lay beneath that frozen wool? "You need warming up proper," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Let me fetch you some broth, at least." He moved to the iron pot that always simmered at the edge of his hearth, filled with whatever game he'd managed to catch. The woman's eyes followed his every movement as he ladled the hot liquid into a tin cup. When he brought it to her, she tried to sit up but couldn't manage it on her own. Grady slipped an arm behind her shoulders, helping her rise enough to sip at the broth. Her body trembled against him, and not just from the cold. Fear radiated from her like heat from the fire. "I won't harm you," he said, though he knew his word meant little to a stranger. "You're safe here." She managed a few swallows of broth before falling back, exhausted. The shivers racking her body were getting worse, not better, despite the fire's warmth. Grady knew enough about the cold to recognize the danger. If he didn't get her properly warm soon, she wouldn't last the night. The cloth had to come off. Frozen fabric against skin would only make things worse, no matter what secret she was trying to hide. "I'm sorry," he said, reaching for the edge of the wool wrapping. "But this has got to go." "No!" Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "Please!" But the weakness in her body betrayed her. and her grip loosened almost immediately. Grady worked as quickly and carefully as he could, unwinding the frozen cloth. As the last layer fell away, his hands froze in place and his breath caught in his throat. There, tucked against the woman's breast, lay a tiny infant. The baby's skin was lighter than its mother's, telling a story Grady wasn't sure he wanted to know. The child's breathing came in shallow gasps, its small face flushed with fever. "Sweet Jesus," Grady whispered, his rough hands hovering uncertainly over the pair. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Help my baby," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "The fever." Grady's mind raced. He'd thought he was dealing with one life in danger. Now he had two, and one of them a babe who looked no more than a few months old. He hadn't been around a child that young since his own sisters were small, back before the war changed everything. Moving quickly now, he gathered every blanket he owned, wrapping mother and child in layers of wool and cotton. He added more wood to the fire until the heat was almost uncomfortable where he stood. Then he began brewing the willow bark tea his mama had taught him about, back when she was still alive to teach such things. The woman watched his every move, her arms never loosening their protective hold on her child. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and hope that cut straight to Grady's heart, past all the walls he'd built around it during his years alone. "What's your name?" he asked softly as he worked. She hesitated, then whispered, "Naichi." Grady nodded, careful to keep his movements slow and predictable. "I'm Grady Boone, though most folks just call me Boone, when they call me anything at all." The baby made a weak crying sound and Naichi immediately tried to comfort it, murmuring words in Apache that Grady couldn't understand. The love in her voice, though, that needed no translation. He brought the willow bark tea over along with more broth. "The tea might help with the fever," he explained. "Can you help the little one drink some?" Naichi nodded, though fear still shadowed her eyes. Together they managed to get a few drops of the tea into the infant's mouth. The baby was so small, its fingers no bigger than mouse paws where they curled against its mother's skin. "Boy or girl?" Grady asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Girl," Naichi answered. "Her name is Sarah." She spoke the English name carefully, and Grady understood it was probably not the only name the child carried. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up the stone chimney. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, a different sort of storm was brewing in Grady's heart. He'd spent so many years keeping the world at arm's length, convinced that solitude was safer than risking care for another soul. Now here he sat, watching over a mother and child who had literally blown in with the winter storm. The baby's breathing was still labored, and Grady knew they weren't out of danger yet. He'd need to keep the fire going strong all night, maybe brew more tea. His stores of firewood would take a hit, but looking at the tiny life struggling before him, he couldn't bring himself to care about that. "Try to rest," he told Naichi, who was clearly fighting to keep her eyes open. "I'll keep watch." She resisted for a moment longer, then exhaustion won out. Her eyes drifted closed, though her arms remained securely around her daughter. Grady settled into his old wooden chair, his mind full of questions he wasn't sure he should ask. How had they ended up out there in the snow? Where had they come from, and what were they running from? The baby's mixed blood told part of the story, but Grady had learned long ago that judging others only led to trouble. Whatever their circumstances, they needed help now, and that's all that mattered. He watched the flames dance in the hearth, listening to the two sets of breathing, one slow and steady, the other too quick and shallow. The world outside his cabin had always seemed plenty big enough when it was just him, but now the single room felt small, barely able to contain the weight of these two precious lives he'd found in the snow. Grady Boone had thought himself done with surprises, done with caring about anyone but himself, but as he sat guard over his unexpected guests, something long dormant stirred in his chest, a feeling he'd thought frozen solid years ago like the creek in deepest winter. Now it thawed, painful and sharp, bringing with it memories of family, of responsibility, of what it meant to be needed. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty. But one thing was clear. Nothing in Grady's carefully ordered life would ever be quite the same again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing all traces of the tracks that had led mother and child to his door. Inside, the fire burned bright and steady, pushing back the darkness and the cold, creating a small island of warmth in the vast wilderness of the mountain night. Through the long night, Grady moved between the fireplace and his unexpected guests like a restless spirit. Every hour brought new worries as he tended to both mother and child. The baby's fever burned hot enough to frighten him, reminding him of nights long ago when his sisters had been sick. Back then, his mother had known just what to do. Now, he struggled to remember her teachings through the fog of years. He kept the fire stoked high, feeding it precious wood that he'd meant to last through the winter. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin's log walls as he heated water in his largest pot, letting it cool just enough before soaking clean rags to lay across the infant's forehead. Mama always said willow bark was God's own medicine for fever, he muttered to himself, searching through the dried herbs he kept hanging from the rafters. The bundles rustled like paper as his fingers found the right one. He'd gathered it months ago, never thinking he'd need it for something like this. While the tea steeped, he watched the woman, Naichi she'd said her name was, clutching her baby even in sleep. Her face was young but worn, marked by worry lines that shouldn't belong on someone her age. The child stirred restlessly against her breast, making small sounds of distress that twisted something deep in Grady's chest. When the tea was ready, he knelt beside them. "Ma'am," he said softly, touching her shoulder. "Need to give the little one some medicine." Naichi's eyes flew open, wild with fear for a moment before recognition settled in. She looked down at her baby, then back at Grady with desperate hope. "The fever?" "Willow bark tea," he explained, holding up the cup. "My mama swore by it. Might help bring the fever down some." She nodded, shifting to sit up straighter. The movement caused the blanket to slip, revealing more of the sleeping infant's face. Grady couldn't help but notice again how the child's skin was several shades lighter than its mother's, the mark of mixed blood that told a story he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. As if reading his thoughts, Naichi's chin lifted. "He is my son," she said firmly. "My Samuel." Grady nodded, careful to keep his face neutral. "Never said he wasn't, ma'am. Now, let's see if we can get some of this tea into him." Together, they worked to coax tiny sips of the bitter liquid into Samuel's mouth. The baby fussed weakly, but managed to swallow most of what they gave him. Grady showed Naichi how to keep the cool cloths on the boy's forehead, changing them when they grew warm. Hours crept by like molasses in winter. Grady dozed in his chair between checking the fire and changing cloths, his dreams troubled by memories of other sickbeds, other fevers that hadn't ended well. Each time he woke, his first glance was toward his guests, making sure they were still breathing. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Grady noticed a change. Samuel's breathing seemed easier, less labored. When he touched the baby's forehead, the skin felt cooler under his rough fingers. "The fever's breaking," he told Naichi, who had barely slept herself. "He's cooling down some." She pressed her lips to Samuel's forehead, murmuring what sounded like a prayer in Apache. Then she looked up at Grady with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He shuffled his feet, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Ain't nothing. Just what anyone would do." But they both knew that wasn't true. Plenty of folks would have left them in the snow, or worse, turned them in to whatever authority was hunting them. The thought made his jaw clench. As morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, Grady knew he needed to tend to his regular chores. The animals wouldn't feed themselves, and his woodpile needed restocking after burning so much during the night. Still, he found himself reluctant to leave the cabin. "I need to see to some things," he told Naichi. "Won't be far. You'll hear me cutting wood just beyond that window there." She nodded, still holding Samuel close. The baby was sleeping peacefully now, his color better than it had been all night. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. New snow had fallen during the night, covering Grady's tracks from when he'd carried Naichi to the cabin. He worked quickly, efficiently, though his mind never strayed far from his guests. The axe rang against wood, splitting logs with practiced swings. Each time he carried an armload back to the cabin, He glanced through the window to check on them. It was during one of these breaks, as he stacked wood by the door, that Naichi began to speak. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of a story she needed to tell. "My husband," she said, looking down at Samuel, "was a soldier. James Avery. He was kind, respectful, different from the others." She traced her finger along Samuel's cheek. "We were married properly in the mission church, but some people, they did not accept it." Grady set down his armload of wood quietly, not wanting to interrupt. He'd known there had to be more to the story. "James was killed 3 months ago, an ambush, they said." Her voice caught. "After that, the other soldiers, they said Samuel should be raised properly, by white people." Her arms tightened around the baby. "They tried to take him, so I ran." The simple words carried volumes of pain and fear. Grady thought of the soldiers he'd known during the war, of the casual cruelty some men were capable of when they thought they were right. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You got papers?" he asked. "For the marriage?" She nodded. "In my bundle. James made sure everything was legal. But papers don't matter to some people." Grady knew she was right. He'd seen enough of the world to know that sometimes the law was just words on paper, easily ignored by those with power and prejudice on their side. The day wore on, sun climbing high in the winter sky. Grady finished his chores but stayed close to the cabin, bringing in more wood than strictly necessary. Each time he entered, he found himself checking Samuel's temperature, relief flooding through him when it remained normal. Naichi grew stronger as the hours passed, though exhaustion still lined her face. She accepted the food Grady offered, beans and salt pork, nothing fancy, with quiet dignity. Samuel nursed eagerly, another good sign. As dusk approached, painting the snow purple and blue, Naichi spoke again. "They will still be looking," she said, her voice heavy with warning. "The soldiers, the townsmen, they will not stop." Grady stood at the window, watching shadows lengthen across the snow. The mountain had always been his refuge, a place where the world's troubles couldn't reach him. Now those troubles had found their way to his door, wrapped in a wool blanket and carrying a baby. He was surprised to realize he didn't mind as much as he should. Years of solitude had built walls around his heart, but something about this woman's quiet strength and her fierce love for her child had found cracks in those walls. "Reckon we'll deal with that when we have to," he said finally, turning back to add another log to the fire. The warmth pushed back against the gathering dark, and Samuel made a small, contented sound in his sleep. Grady found himself hoping that the snow would keep falling, covering their tracks deeper, keeping the outside world at bay just a little longer. He'd spent so long keeping people away, convincing himself that loneliness was safer than caring. Now watching Naichi sing softly to her son in the firelight, he wondered if he'd been wrong about that all along. The cabin felt different with them in it, less empty, more alive. Though danger might be coming with the dawn, for now there was only the quiet peace of the evening, the soft breathing of the sleeping baby, and the knowledge that sometimes hope could arrive in the most unexpected ways. Morning light crept through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Grady stirred from his makeshift bed near the hearth, where he'd spent another night keeping watch. The door rattled in its frame as a bitter wind swept down from the mountains, sending a chill draft through the cabin. Naichi sat in Grady's old rocking chair, Samuel bundled against her chest. The baby had improved through the night, his breathing steady and strong. She looked up as Grady rose, her dark eyes alert despite her weariness. "That door needs fixing," Grady muttered, more to himself than to her. He'd been meaning to repair it for months, but living alone, he'd grown used to the draft. Now, with a recovering woman and infant to consider, such details seemed more pressing. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, then stepped outside to assess the door's condition. The hinges had worked loose over time, and the wood had warped slightly with age and weather. Inside, he could hear Samuel's soft morning cries and Naichi's gentle humming. Grady gathered his tools, hammer, nails, and a few pieces of scrap wood he'd been saving. The familiar work of repairs settled him, gave his hands purpose. He removed the door carefully, adjusted the frame, and reset the hinges with fresh screws he'd been hoarding. As he worked, Naichi watched from inside, Samuel at her breast. "You are kind," she said softly, "to make such changes for us." Grady felt his ears grow warm. "Ain't nothing. Should have done it long ago." He tested the door's swing, satisfied with its smoother motion. "Door like this could save your life in winter." When he finished with the door, Grady noticed Naichi watching the woodpile with interest. Her color was better today, though she still moved carefully, protecting her healing body. "I can help," she offered, setting Samuel in a nest of blankets near the fire. "I am stronger now." Grady hesitated. "Don't want you wearing yourself out too soon." But Naichi's chin lifted with that quiet dignity he was coming to recognize. "I will not be helpless. Show me." After a moment's consideration, Grady nodded. He gathered a few smaller logs and his kindling axe, then demonstrated the careful motion of splitting kindling, how to hold the wood, where to strike, how to control the blade. "Like this," he explained, splitting a piece with practiced ease. The wood fell into neat sections, perfect for starting fires. Ain't about strength so much as knowing where to hit. Naichi watched intently, then took the axe from him. Her first attempts were awkward, but she persisted. Soon she had a small pile of usable kindling, her face showing quiet satisfaction at the achievement. "You learn quick," Grady observed, impressed despite himself. She smiled slightly. "My people have always known how to survive. We adapt." While Naichi continued with the kindling, Grady prepared to check his trapline and set new snares. The winter had been lean, and with 2 more mouths to feed, he needed to ensure their food supply. "I won't be gone long," he told her, checking his rifle and gathering his trapping gear. "Stay inside, keep the door barred. If anyone comes—" He paused, considering the possibility. "Best if no one knows you're here." Naichi nodded gravely. "We will be quiet as shadows." The morning air bit sharp and clean as Grady made his way through the snow. He checked his existing traps first, finding 2 rabbits, not a bad harvest for winter. As he reset the traps and placed new snares, his thoughts kept returning to the cabin and its occupants. He'd grown used to silence, to the simple rhythm of survival. Now his world had shifted, filled with the soft sounds of Naichi's voice and Samuel's cries. It unsettled him how quickly they'd become part of his daily concerns. When he returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, he found Naichi had kept busy. The kindling was neatly stacked, and she'd swept the floor with his old broom. Samuel slept peacefully in his blanket nest, one tiny fist curled near his face. Together they prepared a simple stew from the rabbits, adding dried vegetables and the last of Grady's stored herbs. The familiar tasks took on new meaning with someone to share them. Naichi moved about the cabin with growing confidence, though Grady noticed she never strayed far from Samuel. As evening settled in, Grady lit the lamp, its warm glow softening the cabin's rough edges. He watched as Naichi lifted Samuel, cradling him close while she fed him. Her face transformed when she looked at her son, fierce love mixing with protective determination. "He is everything to me," she said quietly, as if reading Grady's thoughts. "When James died, I thought my heart would stop beating. But Samuel—" She touched the baby's cheek. "He gave me reason to keep going." Grady nodded, understanding more than he could say. He'd seen that kind of love before, in his mother's eyes when she'd tended his siblings through fever and hardship. "In the snow," Naichi continued, her voice soft but clear, "I prayed. I asked Creator God to send help, someone who would see us as people, not just as problems to solve." She looked up at Grady. "He answered through you." Grady shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Faith was a subject he'd avoided for years, since watching too many good men die believing God would protect them. Yet something in Naichi's simple certainty touched a long-buried part of him. "Reckon I just did what needed doing," he mumbled. "Sometimes," Naichi said. "That is how Creator works, through simple acts of kindness." Before Grady could respond, a sound froze them both, the distinct rhythm of hoofbeats on the trail outside. Grady moved swiftly, snuffing the lamp with one quick motion. Darkness flooded the cabin as he pressed against the wall near the window, hand on his rifle. Naichi had already melted into the shadows with Samuel, her movements silent as a breath. They waited, hearts pounding, as the hoofbeats grew closer. Through the window's frosted pane, Grady could make out the shapes of riders passing. 3, maybe 4, their forms dark against the snow. They moved steady and purposeful, like men searching for something. Or someone. Minutes stretched like hours as they listened to the hoofbeats fade into the distance. Even after the sound disappeared, Grady waited before relighting the lamp, his hands slightly unsteady with the matches. In the renewed light, he saw Naichi still holding Samuel close, her face composed but her eyes wide with fear she couldn't quite hide. The baby slept on, unaware of the danger that had passed so near. "They will keep looking," she whispered. Grady nodded grimly. "But the snow's getting thicker. Trail will be covered by morning." Outside, fat flakes were indeed falling faster, adding to the blanket of white that already covered the mountain. The storm might buy them time, but Grady knew it was only temporary protection. Sooner or later, choices would have to be made. He stoked the fire higher, trying to chase away the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The cabin felt different now, no longer just his refuge, but a fortress protecting something precious and threatened. Naichi began to hum softly to Samuel, an ancient melody that seemed to speak of both sorrow and hope. Grady found himself listening, thinking of his mother's hymns, of faith lost, and perhaps not entirely forgotten. The snow continued to fall, thick and silent, as darkness settled fully over the mountain. In the cabin's warmth, Grady watched Naichi with her child, and felt something shift inside him, a stirring of protective instinct, of faith, of fear. God might indeed be at work here, he thought, though what that meant for any of them remained to be seen. For now, there was only the quiet of the cabin, the soft sounds of Samuel's breathing, and the knowledge that danger lurked beyond their walls, waiting in the gathering snow. Dawn painted the sky in pale stripes of pink and gray as Grady eased his cabin door open. Fresh snow had fallen through the night, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket that stretched unbroken across the mountain, almost unbroken. His experienced eyes caught the telltale depression of hoofprints, now partially filled with fresh powder. Rifle ready, Grady followed the tracks. The crisp morning air burned his lungs as he moved cautiously through the snow. 20 yards from his cabin, the prints became clearer. 4 horses had passed, their riders keeping a steady line along the game trail. They'd come within spitting distance of his home. Grady knelt to examine the tracks more closely. The horses had been shod, town horses, not Indian ponies. That meant townsfolk, probably searching these mountains for exactly what he was hiding in his cabin. His jaw tightened at the thought. Back inside, he found Naichi already awake, feeding Samuel near the warmth of the fireplace. She looked up at his entrance, reading his expression. "They were close," she said. It wasn't a question. Grady nodded, hanging his rifle back on its pegs. 4 riders from town, I reckon. They'll likely be back. Folk get mighty suspicious of strangers in these mountains, especially in winter. Naichi's arms tightened around Samuel, but her voice remained steady. "What should we do?" "Need to check my trapline," Grady said, gathering his gear. "Might as well show you the route, case you ever need to find your way." He didn't finish the thought, in case you need to run. Naichi wrapped Samuel securely against her chest with a long cloth, the way her people had carried babies for generations. The child settled easily, used to this arrangement. Together, they stepped out into the morning light. Grady led them along his familiar path, showing Naichi how to spot his trail markers, a broken branch here, a stack of stones there. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they moved between the towering pines. He found himself impressed by how quietly she moved, even with the baby. The first trap held a fox, its red-brown fur thick with winter growth. Grady demonstrated how to reset the mechanism while Naichi watched intently. At the second trap, they found 2 plump rabbits. "Good eating," Grady commented, securing their catch. "Fur will trade well too come spring." As they worked, Naichi began to sing softly, not in English, but in her own tongue. The melody was simple, rising and falling like a gentle breeze. Samuel cooed in response, his tiny fingers curling against his mother's shoulder. A prayer, she explained, catching Grady's questioning look. For health, for protection. My people believe songs carry power, especially for the young ones. Grady nodded, remembering his own mother's hymns. Reckon every culture has its ways of asking for help. Back at the cabin, they fell into an easy rhythm of work. Grady showed Naichi how to stretch the fox pelt while he cleaned the rabbits. She picked up the technique quickly, her hands sure and capable. Like this? She asked, carefully working the hide over the stretching frame. Just so, Grady confirmed. Need to keep it even or it'll dry wrong. As they worked, Naichi continued her quiet song. Gradually, she began teaching Grady the words, an Apache prayer for health and strength. His tongue stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, but she was patient, repeating each phrase until he got it right. The afternoon light was fading when they finished their tasks. Grady built up the fire while Naichi prepared the rabbit meat for cooking. Samuel slept peacefully in his blanket nest, occasionally making small sounds of contentment. Never thought I'd be learning Apache prayers, Grady said, more to himself than to her. Naichi looked up from her work. Never thought I would marry a white soldier either. Life takes unexpected turns. Something in her tone made Grady pause. He'd been wanting to ask about her past but hadn't found the right way. Now, in the growing firelight, she seemed ready to share her story. His name was James Avery, she began, her voice soft but clear. Corporal James Avery. He was different from the other soldiers, saw me as a person, not just some Indian woman to be used and discarded. Grady settled into his chair, listening intently as Naichi continued. There was a sergeant who thought he could do what he wanted with the native women near the fort. James stopped him, defended me. Her hands worked steadily at the cooking pot, but her eyes were distant, remembering. He took a beating for it too, but he didn't back down. She stirred the stew slowly. We fell in love. Real love, not just convenience. James didn't care what anyone thought. He made sure our marriage was proper, recorded in the army books. Said he wanted everything legal and right so no one could ever question it. Grady watched as she touched Samuel's cheek gently. This little one is proof of that love. James was so happy when he found out about the baby. Said he'd request a transfer to a safer post, somewhere we could raise our child in peace. Her voice caught slightly. But then the ambush happened. Apache raiders hit a supply wagon, not my people, a different band. James was part of the escort. They found his body 2 days later. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Grady's hands had curled into fists without him realizing it. The army. Naichi's voice hardened. They refused to recognize our marriage. Said there was no record, though I know James filed the papers. Called me a liar when I tried to claim his pension for Samuel's sake. And the townsfolk. She shook her head. They were worse, started saying I must have stolen the baby from some white family. That no proper soldier would marry an Apache. That I should be arrested, Samuel taken away. Grady's knuckles were white with tension. That ain't right, he growled. Ain't right at all. No, Naichi agreed quietly. It is not right. But it is the way things are. I had no choice but to run, to protect my son. I will not let them take him from me. He is all I have left of James, of our love. Samuel stirred in his sleep, making small fussing sounds. Naichi went to him, lifting him with practiced gentleness. The baby settled immediately in her arms, recognizing his mother's touch. Anyone with eyes can see he's yours, Grady said, his voice rough with emotion. Way he looks at you, way he calms when you hold him. Don't take no army paper to prove that. Naichi's eyes met his, filled with gratitude for his understanding. But the world does not see with a father's eyes, or a mother's heart. They see what they want to see, believe what fits their ideas of how things should be. Grady stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. The injustice of it all made his blood boil. A proper marriage denied, a widow and child forced to flee, all because of nothing more than prejudice and lies. Ain't right, he repeated more forcefully. Man does the honorable thing, marries proper, and they just erase it? Treat his wife and child like criminals? James knew it might be like this. Naichi said softly. He tried to protect us as best he could, making sure there were witnesses to our vows, filing papers in triplicate. But paper burns, records get lost, and people believe what they choose to believe. Grady stopped his pacing, looking at mother and child in the firelight. Naichi's quiet dignity in the face of such wrong stirred something deep in him. Memories of his own mother's strength, of lessons learned about standing up for what's right no matter the cost. Well, he said firmly, they ain't gonna find you here, not while I draw breath. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Naichi. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even known he felt that strongly until the words were out. But he knew they were true. Something about this woman and her child, about the injustice they faced, had awakened a protective instinct he thought long dead. Naichi bowed her head slightly, acknowledging his declaration with characteristic grace. Thank you, she said simply, for believing us, for helping us, for... She glanced around the cabin that had become their sanctuary, for everything. Outside, the mountain night was settling in, stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Somewhere in that darkness, Grady knew, men were still searching. But in here, in the warmth of his cabin, a mother held her child safely, and for now that was enough. The stew bubbled gently over the fire, filling the air with savory scents. As they settled in to eat, Grady found himself watching Naichi and Samuel, thinking about courage and justice, about promises made and kept, about the strange ways life could change a person's heart. He might be just one mountain man, but he'd meant what he said. They were under his protection now, and he aimed to keep them safe, no matter what came next. 3 days of relative peace settled over Grady's mountain cabin like the fresh snow blanketing the surrounding peaks. The routine they established felt almost natural, Grady checking his trap lines while Naichi kept the home fires burning and tended to Samuel's needs. On the first morning, Grady watched from the doorway as Naichi sat cross-legged by the fire, needle flashing in the early light as she mended one of his old shirts. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, turning the worn fabric into something serviceable again. Samuel lay beside her on a soft deerskin, occasionally reaching up to grasp at invisible things with his tiny fists. "Ain't necessary to fix my old things," Grady said gruffly, adjusting his coat. Naichi looked up, her dark eyes warm. "You have given us shelter. This is the least I can do to repay your kindness." The snowstorms came in waves, forcing them to spend long hours indoors. The cabin, which had known only solitude for so many years, now held conversations that stretched into the evening hours. The crackling fire and Samuel's soft breathing created a peaceful backdrop as Naichi shared stories of her people. "In my tribe," she explained on the second evening, her voice soft as she rocked Samuel, "we believe songs carry power. They can heal, bring rain, or guide a soul home." She hummed a gentle melody, and Samuel's eyes grew heavy with sleep. Grady found himself leaning forward in his chair, drawn in by the unfamiliar rhythms. "Never heard anything quite like that before." "It is a lullaby my grandmother taught me," Naichi explained. "The words speak of gentle winds and peaceful dreams." She continued singing, her voice carrying through the cabin like a warm breeze. The third day brought the heaviest snow yet. Grady had barely managed to check his closest snares before the white wall of weather forced him back inside. He stamped the snow from his boots while Naichi stirred a pot of rabbit stew. "Storm's getting worse," he reported, hanging his coat by the fire. "Might be stuck inside a spell." Naichi nodded, adding a pinch of dried herbs to the stew. "The winter spirits are dancing," she said. "My people say such storms come when they celebrate." As evening settled in, Samuel began to fuss more than usual. Naichi walked with him, singing softly, while Grady tried to lose himself in the familiar task of cleaning his rifle. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's walls. The sharp knock at the door cut through the peaceful scene like a knife. Grady's hand moved to his rifle before he'd even fully registered the sound. Naichi was already moving, silent as a shadow, toward the back corner where they'd prepared a hiding spot behind some storage barrels. Another knock, harder this time. "Hello, the cabin." Grady waited until Naichi and Samuel were completely hidden before approaching the door. He kept his rifle ready but slightly lowered, threatening enough to give pause, but not so aggressive as to provoke immediate violence. Opening the door, he found himself facing two men on horseback. Snow swirled around them in the darkness, their horses stamping restlessly in the cold. The riders' faces were mostly hidden by scarves, but their eyes were hard and suspicious. "Evening," Grady said flatly. "Mighty late for social calls." The first rider, a broad-shouldered man with a gray wool coat, leaned forward in his saddle. "Been tracking all day, looking for someone, Apache woman, traveling with a white baby she stole. Seen anything like that?" "Ain't seen nobody," Grady replied. "Been holed up here with these storms, just me and my traps." The second rider, thinner and wearing a deputy's badge, spoke up. "Mind if we warm up a spell? Could use some coffee if you've got it." Grady's hand tightened on his rifle. "Ain't really set up for company. Besides, storm's getting worse. Best you boys head back to town while you can still see the trail." The deputy's eyes narrowed, trying to peer past Grady into the cabin's interior. "Seems mighty inhospitable, friend. Man alone up here might appreciate some company now and then." "I ain't your friend," Grady stated plainly, "and I prefer my solitude, that's why I live up here." The first rider started to say something else, but a particularly strong gust of wind cut him off, bringing a blast of snow that made the horses dance nervously. "Listen," the deputy tried again. "That woman's dangerous. Bewitched a soldier, then killed him when he wouldn't marry her. Stole his child and ran. It's our duty to bring her to justice." Grady felt a surge of anger at the lies, but kept his voice steady. "Like I said, ain't seen nobody. Now, unless you're planning to try coming in uninvited, I suggest you ride on." His hand moved deliberately to rest on his rifle's stock. The gesture wasn't lost on either rider. They exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. "We'll be back," the first rider warned, "with more men. This whole mountain's going to be searched proper once the weather clears." "Your time to waste," Grady replied, "but right now you're burning daylight you can't spare." After another tense moment, the riders turned their horses away from the cabin. Grady watched until they disappeared into the swirling snow before closing and barring the door. He waited, listening carefully, until he was certain the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Only then did he move to help Naichi out from her hiding place. She emerged with Samuel clutched tightly to her chest, her face composed but her eyes reflecting deep worry. The baby had stayed remarkably quiet during the confrontation, but now he began to cough, a wet, troubling sound that made both adults exchange concerned looks. "They're spreading lies about James," Naichi said softly, rubbing Samuel's back as he continued coughing. "Making me into a murderer when all I did was love him and bear his child." Grady paced the cabin's length, his movements sharp with frustration. "Ain't right, any of it, but they're not gonna stop. Deputy wasn't lying about bringing more men once the weather clears." Samuel's coughing grew worse, each bout shaking his tiny frame. Naichi pressed her lips to his forehead, then looked up at Grady with alarm. "He's burning up again." Grady quickly gathered the willow bark and other herbs they'd used before when Samuel's fever had spiked. As he worked to prepare the remedies, his mind raced through their limited options. The cabin had been safe enough when the danger was distant, but now... "Need to think on what to do next," he said, passing Naichi the medicine. "Can't stay here much longer, not with them planning to search proper. But can't travel far neither, not with Samuel sick in the weather like this." Naichi administered the medicine to Samuel with gentle determination, though her hands trembled slightly. "I will not let them take him," she stated firmly. "I would rather die in these mountains." "Ain't going to come to that," Grady assured her, his voice gruff with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "We'll figure something out. But first, we need to get his fever down." Through the long night that followed, they took turns walking with Samuel, trying to ease his coughing and cool his fever. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tension built. Every distant sound made them freeze, listening for returning riders. Every cough from Samuel sent fresh waves of worry through them both. Grady found himself watching Naichi as she sang to Samuel in the dark hours before dawn. Her voice was hoarse from a night of singing, but she didn't stop. The ancient melodies of her people filled the cabin, a defiant answer to the wind's howling. Despite his usual distance from matters of faith, Grady found himself adding his own silent prayers to her songs. As the first gray light of morning began to seep through the cabin's window, Samuel's cough finally seemed to ease. His breathing, while still labored, grew more regular. Naichi's shoulders sagged with relief as she felt his forehead. "The fever is lower," she reported, the exhaustion clear in her voice. Grady nodded, stoking the fire back to life. "Good, but we need to make plans. Can't wait for them to come back with reinforcements." "I know," Naichi said softly, still cradling Samuel. "But where can we go? Who would help an Apache woman and her mixed-blood child?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of all they faced. Outside, the storm was beginning to fade, taking with it what protection it had provided. Soon, the weather would clear enough for the searchers to return, and their fragile peace would shatter. Grady watched mother and child in the growing light, feeling the responsibility settle firmly on his shoulders. He'd made a choice when he first brought them in from the snow, and again when he'd lied to the riders. Now he would have to see that choice through, whatever it might cost him. Samuel coughed again in his sleep, a reminder of how precarious their situation remained. Naichi hummed softly, rocking him, while Grady moved to check their supplies. They would need to be ready to move quickly when the time came. But for now, all they could do was wait and watch the snow fall. Morning crept over the mountains in shades of slate and pearl, the sun a pale disk behind thick clouds. Grady stood at his cabin door, axe in hand, watching the trail below with wary eyes. The fresh snow from last night had softened every edge of the landscape, but he knew the peaceful scene was deceptive. He hefted the axe and headed toward his woodpile, boots crunching in the snow. Every few strokes he would pause, scanning the trail that wound down the mountainside. The sound of splitting wood echoed across the silent slopes, making him grimace. The noise might draw attention, but they needed the warmth. Inside the cabin, Naichi tended to Samuel, whose coughing had grown worse through the night. The sound carried through the thin walls, making Grady's shoulders tense with each ragged burst. A movement in the distant trees caught his eye. He froze, axe mid-swing, but it was only a deer picking its way through the snow. Still, his nerves wouldn't settle. The visitors from yesterday had promised to return with more men. It was only a matter of time. The cabin door creaked open. "Grady?" Naichi's voice was strained. "Do you have more willow bark? Samuel's fever is rising again." He planted the axe in a stump and gathered an armload of split wood. "Got some dried in the root cellar. I'll fetch it once I bring these in." Inside the cabin, the air was thick with worry. Samuel lay bundled in Naichi's arms, his small face flushed with fever. His breathing came in wheezing gasps that made Grady's chest tighten with concern. "Ain't right," he muttered, setting down the wood. "Breathing shouldn't sound like that." Naichi pressed her lips to Samuel's forehead, her face creased with fear. "It is worse than before. The medicine helped last night, but now—" "I'll get that willow bark," Grady said quickly, heading for the trapdoor that led to his root cellar. The small space below the cabin floor held his winter stores, dried herbs, preserved meat, and root vegetables. He found the willow bark wrapped in a clean cloth exactly where he'd left it. While he prepared the tea, Naichi paced with Samuel, humming softly. The familiar routine of measuring herbs and heating water felt inadequate against the child's obvious distress. They passed the morning in tense silence, broken only by Samuel's coughing and the occasional crackle of the fire. Grady made several trips outside for wood, each time scanning the horizon for riders. The gray day wore on, heavy with unspoken fears. As evening approached, Naichi stirred the pot of rabbit stew hanging over the fire. Samuel had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep, wrapped in blankets in the corner. His breathing was still labored, but the willow bark tea had helped some. "We need to talk," Naichi said quietly as she ladled stew into tin bowls. Grady accepted his portion with a grunt, already dreading whatever she was about to say. He'd seen the determined set of her jaw, the way she'd been thinking hard all afternoon. "I want to go to town," she stated, her voice firm despite its softness. "I want to face them openly." Grady nearly choked on his stew. "That's madness." "I have proof of my marriage to James," she continued, undeterred. "His letters, our marriage certificate from the mission. If I could just show them—" "They won't care about paper," Grady cut in harshly. "Won't even let you speak before they string you up." "You don't know that." "I know men," he growled. "Seen what fear and hatred can do. They've already decided what you are. A killer, a kidnapper. Truth won't matter to them now." Naichi's eyes flashed. "So I should hide forever? Let them make my son an outcast, deny his father's name?" "Better an outcast than an orphan," Grady shot back. They glared at each other across the small table, the stew cooling between them. Samuel's wheezing breaths filled the tense silence. "My husband was a good man," Naichi said, her voice thick with emotion. "He believed in justice, in doing what was right even when it was hard. How can I teach Samuel to be brave if I spend his life running?" Grady pushed his bowl away, frustrated. "Ain't about being brave. It's about staying alive. Town's full of men who lost kin to raids, who blame all Apache for what some did. They won't see a widow with proof. They'll see what they want to see." "And what do you see?" Naichi challenged. "A threat? A burden?" "I see a mother and child who deserve better than a lynch mob's justice," Grady snapped. Before Naichi could respond, Samuel's cough erupted into a harsh, rattling wheeze. Both adults rushed to his side, their argument forgotten in the face of his struggle for breath. "Here, let me," Grady said gruffly, reaching for the child. To his surprise, Naichi handed Samuel over without protest. Grady cradled the infant awkwardly, muscle memory from decades past slowly returning. He'd done this for his younger siblings during the fever that took them, walking endless circles, praying for dawn. The weight of Samuel in his arms brought those memories rushing back, the helplessness, the fear, the desperate hope for one more breath. He began to pace, bouncing slightly with each step as Samuel wheezed against his shoulder. The cabin wasn't large, but he made the circuit again and again, his movements gentle despite his size. Naichi knelt by the fire, her lips moving in prayer. The Apache words mixed with Christian phrases James had taught her, a mother's desperate plea to any power that might listen. "Great Spirit, watch over my son. Lord Jesus, heal his breathing. Don't take him from me, please." Samuel's next breath caught in his throat, triggering another coughing fit. Grady patted his back carefully, remembering how his mother had done the same for his siblings. The memory of their loss made his throat tight. "Come on, little one," he murmured. "You're stronger than this." Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes drifting past the window. The soft sound seemed to mock their fear, offering beauty while Samuel struggled for each breath. Grady continued his pacing, counting the infant's respirations, willing them to ease. Naichi's prayers had fallen silent, but her hands were clasped tight enough to whiten her knuckles. She watched Grady move with their son, her face a mask of maternal anguish. The argument about facing the town seemed distant now, overshadowed by the immediate crisis of Samuel's illness. The cabin grew darker as evening deepened, but neither adult moved to light the lamp. They remained caught in their vigil, measuring time by Samuel's labored breaths, each one a victory and a terror. The snow continued to fall outside, building fresh drifts that would hide their tracks, and perhaps delay their pursuers, for at least another day. Dawn was still hours away when Grady made his decision. He hadn't slept, spending the night watching Samuel struggle for each breath while Naichi dozed fitfully beside the fire. The boy's wheezing had grown worse, and no amount of willow bark tea seemed to help anymore. Grady moved quietly through the cabin, gathering supplies. They needed real medicine, the kind only a proper doctor could provide. The nearest one was in town, a half-day's journey through the snow. The risk was great, but watching Samuel suffer was worse. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside to prepare the mule sled. The night air bit sharp and clean, stars still bright overhead. His breath clouded as he worked, harnessing his old mule, Jenny, to the wooden runners. The creature stamped her feet and snorted, not pleased to be roused so early. "Easy there, girl," Grady murmured, patting her neck. "Got important work today." Back inside, he found Naichi already awake, watching him with knowing eyes. "We're going to town," he said gruffly, not a question. She nodded, pulling Samuel closer. The infant's breathing rasped in the quiet cabin. "Reverend Taylor's got a church there," Grady explained as he gathered blankets. "Known him to help folks before, even those others turned away. Reckon we try him first, before the doctor." "Will he welcome us?" Naichi asked softly, rising to help pack. "He follows a higher law than most," Grady replied. "Least, that's what he preaches." They worked quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, loading the sled with necessities. Grady wrapped Naichi and Samuel in his thickest blankets, then added furs for extra warmth. The boy's fever burned against his hand as he tucked the layers close. Stars were just beginning to fade when they set out. Grady led Jenny carefully down the mountain trail, one hand on her bridle, the other holding a lantern. The sled runners whispered through fresh snow, leaving twin tracks in their wake. The going was slow. Drifts had filled parts of the trail, forcing them to break new paths. Jenny worked steadily, steam rising from her flanks, but even she struggled in the deeper spots. Grady kept glancing back at his passengers, checking that the blankets stayed secure. Naichi sat straight-backed despite the cold. Samuel held tight against her chest. Her hood was pulled low, shadowing her face, but Grady could hear her whispered prayers mixing with the creak of leather harness and the swish of runners through snow. The sun rose pale through clouds, casting weak light across the white landscape. They stopped briefly at a stream so Jenny could drink, but Grady had to break ice from the edges first. His hands ached with cold by the time he finished, and he flexed them repeatedly as they continued on. "How is he?" Grady asked during another rest, coming alongside the sled. Naichi pulled back the blankets just enough to show Samuel's flushed face. "The fever holds. His breathing ... She trailed off as another wheeze shook the tiny body. Grady nodded grimly and urged Jenny forward again. The mule's ears flicked back at his voice, her hooves finding sure purchase despite the treacherous footing. The morning wore on, marked by the slow transition of shadows across the snow. It was near midday when they caught the first glimpse of smoke rising from town chimneys. Grady felt Naichi tense behind him, her grip on Samuel tightening. The settlement wasn't large, a dozen buildings strung along the main street with scattered homesteads beyond. But to someone fleeing persecution, it must have looked like a fortress of enemies. "Keep your hood low," Grady reminded her, though she needed no such warning. "We'll go straight to the church." The small clapboard building sat at the edge of town, its weathered cross rising above a snow-laden roof. Grady had avoided it for years, carrying too many bitter memories of unanswered prayers. Now he found himself hoping that old Reverend Taylor's faith would prove stronger than town prejudice. He helped Naichi down from the sled, supporting her carefully on the slick ground. Samuel's breathing seemed harder after the long journey, each intake a visible struggle. They hurried toward the church steps, boot prints marking their path in the fresh snow. Grady knocked firmly on the church door, trying to still his racing heart. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then footsteps approached from inside, and the door creaked open to reveal Reverend Taylor's weathered face. The preacher's eyes widened slightly at the sight of them, Grady, whom he hadn't seen in years, and a heavily cloaked woman holding a bundled infant. But his voice, when he spoke, held nothing but welcome. Come in, he said, stepping back. "You'll catch your death in this cold." The church interior was warmer than outside, though not by much. A small stove in the corner gave off modest heat, and the morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting pale shapes on the wooden pews. "Reverend," Grady began, but a harsh cough from Samuel interrupted him. Naichi pulled back her hood, revealing her face. To his credit, Reverend Taylor showed no shock at her Apache features, only concern, as he moved closer to examine the struggling child. "How long has he been ill?" the preacher asked, gesturing for them to come near the stove. "The fever started days ago," Naichi replied softly. "The cough grows worse." Reverend Taylor nodded, his lined face thoughtful. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms. After a moment's hesitation, Naichi carefully transferred Samuel to the preacher's embrace. The old man cradled the infant with practiced ease, studying his flushed face and listening to his labored breathing. "Poor little one," he murmured. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to pray, his voice gentle but firm. "Dear Lord, look upon this child of yours with mercy. Ease his suffering, grant him strength, and remind us all that in your eyes every soul is precious." Grady shifted uncomfortably at the words, but Naichi's eyes filled with tears. The preacher continued, one hand resting lightly on Samuel's forehead. "This is your child, Lord, created in your image, beloved by you regardless of his parentage or the color of his skin. Guide us to show your love to him and his mother, to be instruments of your healing and peace, may." When he finished praying, Reverend Taylor looked directly at Grady. "You were right to bring them here first," he said quietly. "There are those in town who would react poorly. But a child's life is at stake, and I will not stand idle while prejudice threatens God's little ones." "Can you help us reach the doctor?" Grady asked, hope rising cautiously in his chest. "Better than that," the preacher replied, carefully returning Samuel to Naichi's arms. "I'll go with you. My presence may help calm any trouble, and Dr. Matthews is a good man who takes his oath seriously. He'll treat the boy regardless of circumstances." "There are men searching for us," Naichi warned. "They believe I stole him." "Yes, I've heard their accusations," Reverend Taylor said grimly. "Deputy Riggs has been particularly vocal about it, but I've also heard other stories, of a soldier who married for love, of a union blessed by God if not by men. The truth has a way of emerging, especially when good people stand firm." He moved to pull on his coat. "We'll take my wagon. It's more comfortable than a sled, and my horses are fresh. Brother Boone, if you'll help me hitch them." Grady nodded, surprised and touched by the old term of address. He hadn't been called brother since leaving the church years ago. "The doctor's office is just past the general store," Reverend Taylor explained as they prepared to leave. "We'll go openly. Nothing feeds suspicion like skulking about. Hold your head high, Mrs. Avery. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Naichi straightened at his words, and even Samuel seemed to breathe a little easier in the warmth of acceptance. As they stepped out into the snow-bright day, Grady felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps reconciliation was possible after all, if there were still men like Reverend Taylor who saw past fear to the humanity beneath. The preacher's blessing had given them more than just words. It had given them a chance. Now they just had to pray it would be enough to save Samuel and find justice in a town too long governed by prejudice and pain. Evening settled over the town like a soft blanket, bringing with it the warm glow of lamplight from the church windows. Inside, tables had been arranged in long rows, laden with steaming bowls of stew and fresh-baked bread. The aroma filled the sanctuary, mixing with the familiar sense of wood polish and lamp oil. Grady stood at the church steps watching Naichi hesitate in the deepening shadows. Samuel, wrapped snugly against the cold, made small sounds against her shoulder. The doctor's medicine had eased his breathing somewhat, but anxiety still lined Naichi's face as she gazed at the gathering inside. "Ain't nobody gonna harm you here," Grady said softly. Reverend Taylor gave his word. Naichi squared her shoulders, adjusting Samuel in her arms. "I know. But their eyes, they see what they want to see." "Then let them see the truth," Grady replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. He opened the door wider, letting golden light spill onto the snow-dusted steps. As they entered, conversations stuttered to a halt. Dozens of eyes turned their way, some widening in recognition, others narrowing with suspicion. Grady felt his jaw tighten, ready to defend them if needed. Reverend Taylor appeared beside them, his weathered face creased in a welcoming smile. "Mrs. Avery, Brother Boone, please come in. We've saved places for you near the stove where it's warmest." The whispers started immediately, rushing through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. "Avery? The missing woman?" "That's the Apache they've been searching for." "Is that truly James Avery's child?" The preacher's voice cut through the murmurs, clear and strong. "Friends, neighbors, we are blessed tonight to welcome those in need of shelter and community. As Christ taught us, I was a stranger and you took me in. Let us show the same grace he has shown to each of us." He gestured toward an empty bench near the wood stove. Grady followed Naichi, positioning himself between her and the closest cluster of townspeople. But as they settled, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Matthews, the doctor's wife, approached with a bowl of steaming stew. "The little one seems better," she said kindly, setting the food before Naichi. "My husband said the medicine should help him sleep tonight." Naichi looked up, surprise flickering across her features. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the food and for your husband's care." Samuel stirred then, opening his eyes. In the lamplight, their pale blue color was unmistakable, the same shade as his father's had been. Several of the closer townswomen noticed, their expressions softening as they recognized James Avery's legacy in the child's face. More people drifted closer, drawn by curiosity that gradually shifted to something gentler. Sarah Cooper, who ran the general store, offered a clean cloth for Samuel to rest on. Old Tom Wilson, who had served with James Avery, cleared his throat roughly before speaking. "The boy favors his pa," he said gruffly. "Same look about the eyes. James was a good man, treated everyone fair." Naichi's hands trembled slightly as she spooned up some stew. "He was," she agreed quietly. "He taught me to read from his Bible, showed me respect when others—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. More bowls appeared on their table, cornbread, preserves, even a slice of apple pie that Mrs. Peterson insisted they share. Each offering came with cautious questions that Naichi answered with steady dignity. Yes, she and James had been properly married. Yes, she had his letters proving it. Yes, Samuel had been born in the Fort Hospital, with the doctor there to witness. Grady watched in amazement as the wall of suspicion began to crack. Not completely. He could still see hostile faces at the edges of the crowd, could hear muttered comments about proper place and natural order. But here, in this warm circle of lamplight, something was changing. Reverend Taylor moved among his congregation, guiding conversations, reminding people of Scripture's teachings about welcome and mercy. His presence seemed to anchor the gathering, preventing any ugly words from taking root. As the meal drew to a close, the preacher raised his voice again. "Before we part this evening, I would like to offer a blessing for young Samuel Avery and his mother." A hush fell over the church. Naichi rose slowly, holding Samuel so his face was visible to all. The baby was awake now, his fever-bright eyes taking in the crowd of strangers. "Heavenly Father," Reverend Taylor began, one hand extended toward them, "we ask your blessing on this child, born of love that crossed the boundaries men create. May he grow in wisdom and strength, knowing both sides of his heritage as gifts from you. Bless his mother who has shown such courage in protecting him. And bless this community that we might learn to see with your eyes, which know no color but the shade of grace." "Amen," came the response, stronger from some throats than others, but present nonetheless. In that moment, as the blessing settled over them like gentle rain, Naichi smiled. It transformed her face, erasing the weeks of fear and hardship. Samuel cooed softly, reaching one tiny hand toward the lamplight, and several women stepped forward to admire him properly. Grady found himself smiling too, warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. He watched Naichi speaking with Mrs. Matthews about teething remedies, saw how naturally she fit into this circle of mothers sharing wisdom. For the first time in years, he felt part of something larger than himself. Not quite a family, perhaps, but a community drawn together by compassion and common ground. The evening wound down slowly, people drifting away in twos and threes. Reverend Taylor approached them as the last guests were leaving. "The parsonage loft is ready for you," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm and private. My wife left fresh blankets and a cradle we used for our own children." "Much obliged," Grady said gruffly, throat tight with unexpected emotion. They followed the preacher through the cold night air to the small house beside the church. The loft was indeed warm, with a small window letting in starlight and a sturdy cradle waiting in the corner. A fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Naichi settled Samuel in the cradle, humming softly, a melody that blended Apache lullaby with Christian hymn. The baby's breathing was easier now, his sleep peaceful for the first time in days. "First real bed we've had in weeks," Grady observed, spreading blankets on the floor for himself. First time I haven't feared what morning might bring, Naichi replied softly. She touched the cradle's smooth wood. Perhaps there is hope after all. But even as they settled into the warmth and safety of the parsonage, other forces stirred in the darkness outside. Beyond the circle of lamplight, beyond the reach of the preacher's blessing, hostile eyes watched the parsonage window. Men gathered in shadows, their whispers carrying plans that would shatter this fragile peace. For now, though, in the quiet loft, Grady allowed himself to believe in possibility. He listened to Samuel's steady breathing, to Naichi's soft prayers, and felt something long frozen inside him begin to thaw. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment of grace was real as the starlight streaming through the window or the warmth of the fire below. Dawn had not yet touched the eastern sky when Grady shook Naichi's shoulder gently. We need to leave, he whispered, careful not to wake Samuel. Town's too dangerous, even with the preacher's blessing. Naichi nodded, already gathering their few belongings. The previous evening's warmth felt like a distant dream in the cold gray light filtering through the loft window. Samuel stirred but didn't wake as his mother wrapped him snugly against her chest. I saw men gathering at the saloon when I checked on the mule, Grady explained, shouldering their packs. Don't like the look in their eyes. They crept down the parsonage stairs, trying not to wake Reverend Taylor's family. Grady had left a note of thanks, along with 2 prime fox pelts as payment for the shelter and kindness. Outside, frost coated every surface and their breath formed thick clouds in the bitter air. The mule stood quietly hitched to the sled, steam rising from its nostrils. Grady helped Naichi settle into the back, making sure she and Samuel were well covered with blankets before taking up the reins. They moved through town like ghosts, keeping to the shadows until they reached the mountain trail. Thought that preacher's words might have changed some hearts, Grady muttered as they began their ascent. Reckon some folks don't want their hearts changed. The sun rose behind heavy clouds, casting weak light over a transformed landscape. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, filling their old tracks and making the trail treacherous. The mule labored through drifts that sometimes reached its chest while Grady walked alongside, breaking trail where needed. By midday, they had covered less than half the distance to the cabin. Samuel woke fussy and hungry, his cough still rough though not as desperate as before. They stopped in the lee of a granite outcropping, sharing cold biscuits from the church supper while Naichi nursed the baby. Storm's coming, Grady observed, studying the slate-colored sky. Going to slow us down more. Naichi pulled Samuel closer, worry creasing her brow. The medicine helps, but he needs warmth and rest. We'll make it, Grady assured her, though doubt gnawed at him. The trail ahead looked impossible in places, choked with snow and fallen branches. They pressed on through the afternoon, making painfully slow progress. Grady had to stop frequently to clear paths through deeper drifts or guide the mule around obstacles. The temperature dropped steadily as clouds thickened overhead. By late afternoon, wet snow began to fall, further reducing visibility. Almost there, Grady called over his shoulder, recognizing a distinctive split pine that marked the final approach to his cabin. Another hour at most. But as they rounded the last bend, Grady stopped so abruptly that the mule snorted in protest. Where his cabin should have stood, a black skeleton of charred logs reached toward the gray sky. Wisps of smoke still rose from the ruins, carrying the acrid smell of burnt wood and destroyed belongings. No, he breathed, stumbling forward. No, no, no. Behind him, he heard Naichi's sharp intake of breath. Samuel began to cry, as if sensing the horror of the moment. The destruction was complete. Roof collapsed, walls reduced to ash, his entire life's work turned to cinders. Even the sturdy stone chimney had partially crumbled. But worst of all was what the destroyers had left as their signature. From the only upright post remaining, part of his front porch support, hung a rope noose, swaying in the bitter wind like a serpent. The message was unmistakable. A warning, a threat, a promise of violence to come. Grady's hands clenched into fists as he surveyed the destruction. 20 years of life in these mountains, reduced to smoking rubble by hate. He thought of his carefully collected furs, his mother's Bible, the chair he'd carved during long winter evenings, all gone. Naichi's voice cut through his rage and grief. "Grady," Samuel's coughing again. The fear in her tone brought him back to their immediate crisis. Night was falling, the temperature plummeting, and they had no shelter. He forced himself to think practically. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles up the ridge," he said, turning back to the sled. "Been empty for years, but it's got walls and a roof. Best we can do tonight." The final leg of their journey was the hardest. Darkness fell quickly, and Grady had to lead the mule carefully, feeling his way along the ridge trail by memory and touch. The snow fell heavier now, driven by gusting wind that cut through their clothes and set the empty noose swinging behind them. Samuel's coughs echoed in the gathering night, each one tearing at Grady's heart. He heard Naichi singing softly to the boy, Apache words mixed with Christian comfort, a mother's love transcending both traditions in her desperate attempt to soothe her child. The line shack appeared suddenly in the gloom, a dark square against the swirling snow. It was little more than a hunter's shelter, abandoned years ago when the fur company that built it went bankrupt. The door hung crooked on leather hinges and gaps showed between the log walls. "It ain't much," Grady apologized, forcing the door open against drifted snow. "But it's standing." Inside, the single room smelled of mold and old smoke. Wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, and part of the roof had rotted away in one corner. But it was dry where it wasn't leaking, and the stone fireplace looked sound. Grady worked quickly, gathering what dry wood he could find nearby while Naichi cleared a space near the hearth. He had to use precious paper from his coat pocket, the last letter from his sister, to start the fire, but soon flames cast warming light through the shack's interior. The mule was brought as close to the building as possible, covered with a blanket and sheltered somewhat by the lee wall. Inside, they hung blankets over the worst gaps in the walls, creating a smaller space around the fireplace that might hold some heat. Naichi sat close to the fire, Samuel held against her chest. The baby's breathing was labored again, the cold journey having taken its toll. They had little food left, just some cornbread and dried meat from their breakfast provisions, but hunger seemed a distant concern compared to keeping warm through the night. "I'm sorry," Grady said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Should never have taken you into town. Should have known better than to trust." "No." Naichi's voice was firm despite her exhaustion. "You were right to try. We saw that some hearts can change. Some people can choose mercy over hate." She stroked Samuel's dark hair, now dusted with ash from their burning shelter. "My husband believed that. He died believing it." Grady stared into the flames, remembering the warmth of the church supper, the tentative acceptance they'd found there. "Ain't enough, though, is it? Not when others choose hate strong enough to burn and threaten and destroy." "It is enough to keep trying," Naichi replied softly. "Enough to show Samuel that love is stronger than fear." She looked up at Grady, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Enough that you risk everything to help a stranger and her child." The wind rose outside, making the shack's timbers creak ominously. Samuel coughed in his sleep, a wet, painful sound that made both adults wince. They huddled closer to the fire, sharing what warmth they could as the night deepened around them. Grady found himself praying for the first time in years, not formal words, but a desperate plea for protection, for guidance, for the strength to face whatever morning might bring. Beside him, he heard Naichi's whispered prayers mixing with his own, Apache and English blending together in the fire-lit darkness. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, burying the ashes of Grady's cabin, wrapping the mountains in a blank white shroud that held no answers to their fears. But in the line shack's sheltering walls, 3 hearts beat on, bound together by circumstance and choice, by destruction and deliverance, by a hope that refused to die even in the face of such hatred. The fire crackled low, casting shadows on the rough walls. They would need more wood soon, but for now, they simply held on, waiting for dawn, praying that Samuel's strength would last through this bitter night of loss and survival. Dawn crept over the mountains with grudging light, revealing a world transformed by fresh snow. Inside the line shack, Grady stirred the meager coals of their fire, adding the last pieces of dry wood. His muscles ached from sleeping upright against the rough wall, but he hadn't dared lie down in the bitter cold. "We need to check the cabin ruins," he said softly to Naichi, who hadn't slept at all, keeping vigil over Samuel through the night. "Might be something worth saving." She nodded, wrapping Samuel tighter in the blanket. The baby's breathing was shallow and quick, his small face flushed with returning fever. They shared the last of their cornbread in silence, saving the bigger piece for Naichi to help her milk stay strong for the baby. The trek back to the burned cabin was slow, their feet breaking through crusty snow with every step. When they arrived, the scene looked even worse in daylight. Ash and charred timber lay scattered across pristine white drifts, like someone had thrown black paint across a clean canvas. Grady began picking carefully through the ruins, testing boards with his boot before stepping on them. The heat of the fire had melted deep into the snow beneath, creating treacherous holes under the fresh powder. He found his iron kettle blackened but intact, half buried in ashes near where the hearth had stood. "Here," he called to Naichi, who stood at the edge of the destruction, sheltering Samuel from the bitter wind. "At least we can heat water proper now." As he dug deeper, he uncovered more survivors of the blaze, a pair of half-burned blankets that could be salvaged by cutting away the scorched edges, some bent but usable cooking utensils, a few tools that had been stored in his root cellar. The cellar itself had partially collapsed, but its stone walls had protected some items from the worst of the fire. Samuel's cough echoed across the snow-covered clearing, the sound weaker than before. Grady glanced up to see Naichi swaying gently, singing soft words to the child in her arms. The sight made his throat tight, such tenderness in the midst of such destruction. They gathered what little they could carry back to the line shack. The kettle proved especially valuable, allowing them to melt clean snow for drinking and for making willow bark tea. But as the morning wore on, Samuel's condition deteriorated rapidly. Around midday, while Grady was outside gathering more firewood, he heard Naichi cry out in terror. He dropped the wood and rushed inside to find her clutching Samuel, whose tiny body had gone rigid, small limbs jerking uncontrollably. "Help him!" she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Please help my baby." Grady stood frozen, watching helplessly as the convulsion gripped the infant. It lasted only moments, but felt like hours. When Samuel finally went still, his breathing was even more labored than before. "We can't wait any longer," Grady said, his voice rough with emotion. "That fever's eating him alive. He needs real medicine, the kind only a doctor can give." Naichi pressed her face against Samuel's, her tears wetting his hot forehead. "The town will kill us," she whispered. "You saw what they did here. They left that rope as a promise." "Maybe so." Grady's jaw tightened. "But if we do nothing, Samuel dies for certain. At least in town we've got a chance. The preacher showed us that. Some folks there have good hearts." "And the others?" Naichi looked up at him, her dark eyes full of fear and fierce mother love. "The ones who burned your home? Let them come." Grady's voice was cold as the wind outside. "I won't let them harm you or the boy. Not while I'm breathing." They spent the afternoon preparing for the journey. Grady found his rifle largely undamaged where he'd hidden it under some furs in the root cellar. He cleaned it meticulously, checking the action and counting his remaining cartridges. His axe he sharpened to a wicked edge on a whetstone salvaged from the ruins. The preparation felt good, giving his hands purpose while his mind wrestled with their desperate situation. He knew the odds they faced. The town deputy, Caleb Riggs, would never let them simply walk in and see the doctor. There would be violence, one way or another. As evening approached, Grady laid out their plan. They would leave at first light, taking the most direct route to town. No more hiding or sneaking. They would go openly, demanding help, as was their right. The doctor was a decent man, Grady knew, more concerned with healing than hatred. If they could reach him, he would help, regardless of Samuel's mixed blood. "We'll take the sled," he explained, checking the harness repairs he'd made. Faster than walking, and you can keep Samuel warm under the blankets. I'll lead the mule. Keep watch for trouble." Naichi nodded, but her eyes were distant as she rocked Samuel. The boy's fever burned hotter with each passing hour. Even the willow bark tea brought no relief now. When darkness fell, they huddled close to their small fire in the line shack. The wind had picked up again, driving snow through every crack and gap in the walls. Their salvaged blankets, smoke-stained and torn, provided little warmth. In the flickering lamplight, Grady watched Naichi weeping silently as she nursed Samuel. Her tears fell on the baby's face, mixing with his fever sweat. Her lips moved in constant prayer, sometimes Apache words, sometimes English, all of it pleading for deliverance. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "protect my son. He's innocent of any wrong. Don't let hatred take him from me. Please, please." Grady turned away, his own eyes burning. He'd long ago lost faith in prayer, lost faith in most everything after the war. But watching Naichi's devotion, hearing the raw trust in her words, he felt something stir in his hardened heart. A memory of his mother's prayers, of childhood faith in a God who heard and answered. He checked his rifle one final time, then laid it carefully beside his bedroll. The axe he propped within easy reach. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, coyotes began to howl. A wild, lonely sound that seemed to echo their own desperate situation. Samuel coughed weakly in his sleep, the sound rattling deep in his chest. Naichi hummed a lullaby, rocking him gently, her tears still falling. Grady added the last pieces of wood to their fire and settled back against the wall, knowing sleep would not come easily to any of them this night. Tomorrow they would face whatever waited in town, mercy or murder, healing or hatred. But tonight, in this broken-down line shack, 3 souls kept vigil together, bound by love and need, and the fierce determination to survive. Grady found himself praying, too, for the first time in years, not with fancy words or formal phrases, but with the simple desperation of a man who had run out of other options. He prayed for Samuel's life, for Naichi's protection, for the strength to do what needed doing when dawn came. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows on the rough walls. Soon they would need to extinguish it to save oil for tomorrow night, assuming they lived to see another night. But for now, its warm glow held back the darkness, like hope defying despair. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees and snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, burying the ashes of Grady's cabin, wrapping the whole world in white silence. Come morning, they would break that silence, marching into town to demand justice and mercy. But for now, they simply endured, keeping watch through the long hours until dawn. The darkness before dawn held a bitter chill as Grady worked by lantern light, hitching the mule to their makeshift sled. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air while he double-checked every strap and binding. They couldn't risk a breakdown, not today. Inside the line shack, Naichi wrapped Samuel in layers of salvaged furs. The child's breathing had grown more labored through the night, each tiny wheeze cutting through Grady's heart like a blade. Time was running out. "Here," Grady said, laying his warmest coat across Naichi's shoulders. "You'll need it more than me." She looked up at him, dark eyes full of worry. "The townsmen who burned your cabin. They will be waiting." "Let them wait." Grady's voice was hard as iron. "We're done hiding." The mule stomped restlessly as they loaded their few remaining possessions onto the sled. Grady had positioned hay bales to create a sheltered spot where Naichi could huddle with Samuel, protected from the wind. His rifle he kept close at hand, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. They set out just as the eastern sky began to lighten. The snow had stopped falling, leaving deep drifts that made travel slow and difficult. Grady led the mule on foot, breaking trail through the fresh powder. Every few minutes he glanced back to check on his passengers. Naichi sat straight-backed despite the cold cradling Samuel against her chest. The boy's face was flushed with fever, his breathing growing more troubled with each passing hour. They had to reach help soon. The sun rose fully as they descended from the mountain, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Under different circumstances, Grady might have found it beautiful. Today, he saw only the distance still to cover and the dangers that waited ahead. By mid-morning, they caught sight of the town's first buildings through the trees. Smoke rose from chimneys into the clear winter sky, and Grady could hear the distant sound of axes chopping wood. Normal morning sounds that somehow felt menacing now. "Remember," he told Naichi quietly, "no matter what happens, stay close to me. We head straight for the doctor's office." She nodded, pulling Samuel's wrappings tighter. The child hadn't stirred in hours, lost in feverish sleep. Their entrance into town did not go unnoticed. A woman hanging washing saw them first, dropping her basket with a startled cry. Within minutes, people began emerging from houses and shops, drawn by the commotion. Grady kept his eyes forward, jaw set, leading the mule down the main street. He could hear the muttering starting, angry voices carrying in the cold air. "It's that Apache woman. And Boone with her? They've got some nerve showing their faces here." The crowd grew quickly, men and women gathering on both sides of the street. Some held axes or pitchforks, others were already running for their rifles. Grady's hand tightened on his own weapon, but he kept walking steadily forward. Deputy Caleb Riggs stepped out of the sheriff's office, hand resting on his pistol. "That's far enough, Boone," he called. "You're harboring a fugitive." Grady stopped the mule but didn't back down. "This child needs a doctor," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's burning with fever." "That half-breed ain't our concern," someone shouted from the crowd. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering mob. With deliberate care, Grady handed his rifle to Naichi and lifted Samuel from her arms. The boy felt like a burning coal against his chest. Holding him where everyone could see, Grady turned in a slow circle. "Look at him," he bellowed. "Look at this innocent child. Are you all so full of hate you'd let a baby die?" The crowd shifted uneasily, but Deputy Riggs stepped forward, drawing his pistol. "Put the child down and step away from the woman, Boone. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "He's dying." Grady's voice cracked with desperation. "Can't you understand that? He needs medicine." More men were appearing with weapons now. Grady could feel Naichi trembling behind him, but she kept his rifle ready, watching their backs. The mob pressed closer, angry voices rising. "Enough!" The command cut through the tension like a knife. Reverend Taylor pushed through the crowd, his white hair gleaming in the winter sun. He walked straight to Grady, ignoring the deputy's warning gesture. "Let me see the child," the preacher said quietly. Grady turned so the Reverend could examine Samuel. The old man's face grew grave as he felt the boy's burning forehead, heard the labored breathing. "This child is indeed very ill," Reverend Taylor announced, turning to face the crowd. "And he is, as Brother Boone said, an innocent. Would you call yourselves Christians and deny help to a suffering infant?" "Reverend," Deputy Riggs protested, "that woman stole—" "That woman is his mother," the preacher's voice rang with authority. "I've seen the proof of her marriage to James Avery. This child is legitimate in the eyes of both God and man." He raised his hands, commanding attention. "The Lord our God tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves, to show mercy to the widow and the orphan. Will you defy his word with your hatred?" The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Several men lowered their weapons, looking ashamed. "I stand with this child," Reverend Taylor declared. "Any man who would harm him or his mother must go through me first." A long moment of tense silence followed. Then Deputy Riggs slowly holstered his pistol, though his face remained hard. "Dr. Matthews," the preacher called, "I know you're watching. This child needs your help." The town doctor emerged hesitantly from his office door. He was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and his hands shook slightly as he approached. "Bring him inside," he said quietly to Grady. "I'll do what I can." The mob began to disperse, though many still watched with suspicious eyes. Reverend Taylor accompanied them to the doctor's office, his presence a shield against further violence. Inside, Grady laid Samuel gently on the examination table, while Dr. Matthews gathered his instruments. Naichi hovered close, one hand always touching her son. The preacher stood guard by the door, his stern gaze discouraging any who might think to interfere. "How long has he been this hot?" the doctor asked, pressing his stethoscope to Samuel's chest. 3 days, Naichi answered softly. "The fever will not break, no matter what we try." Dr. Matthews nodded, continuing his examination with trembling but gentle hands. Outside, they could hear the crowd slowly breaking up, though angry voices still carried on the winter air. Grady stood at the window, watching the street while the doctor worked. His heart was still racing from the confrontation, but a small measure of hope had returned. They had made it this far. Perhaps there was still a chance for Samuel. The morning sun climbed higher, shining through frosted window panes as the doctor listened to Samuel's breathing, mixed medicines, and began his treatment. In the quiet of his office, hatred seemed to lose its power, replaced by the simple human duty to heal. Reverend Taylor's words had reminded them all of a higher law than fear or prejudice. Now they could only wait and pray and trust that mercy would prove stronger than malice. The doctor's hands had steadied as he worked, his initial nervousness replaced by professional focus. "I believe we got him here in time," he said softly. "But it will take several days of treatment before he's out of danger." Naichi's tears fell freely now, but they were tears of relief rather than despair. Grady felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen, though he kept his vigil at the window. They weren't safe yet, but for this moment at least, hope had found them again. Inside Dr. Matthews' office, the afternoon light filtered through frosted windows as Samuel lay small and fragile on the examination table. The doctor worked methodically, measuring dark drops of laudanum into a glass of water. "Just 3 drops for a child his size," Dr. Matthews explained, demonstrating the dose for Naichi. "Any more would be dangerous. Give this to him every 4 hours while the fever persists." Naichi nodded, memorizing every detail as she dabbed Samuel's forehead with a cool cloth. The doctor showed her how to prepare warm compresses for the boy's chest, explaining how they would help ease his breathing. Grady stood rigid by the door, his shoulders tense as he listened to the murmur of angry voices outside. Through the window, he could see several men still lingering in the street, their faces dark with suspicion and hate. His hand never strayed far from his rifle. Hours crept by like molasses. The doctor worked steadily, checking Samuel's pulse and breathing, adjusting treatments as needed. Reverend Taylor remained with them, his presence both comfort and shield. Sometimes he would step outside to disperse gathering crowds, his firm voice carrying authority that even the angriest men respected. As evening approached, Samuel's breathing gradually grew easier. His small chest rose and fell in a steadier rhythm, and the burning heat began to fade from his skin. When Dr. Matthews checked his temperature again, a smile crossed his tired face. "The fever's breaking," he announced quietly. "He's going to be all right." The words hit Grady like a physical blow. His legs suddenly felt weak, and he sagged against the doorframe, the tension of days finally catching up with him. Naichi wept silently, her hands clasped in prayer as she watched her son's peaceful sleep. "You'll all stay at the parsonage tonight," Reverend Taylor said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've already sent word to my wife to prepare the loft." As darkness fell, they made their way through back streets to the church, Samuel bundled securely in Naichi's arms. The parsonage loft was warm, fresh hay spread beneath clean blankets. They could smell bread baking below, and soon the Reverend's wife brought up bowls of hot stew. Grady sat near the small window, watching Samuel sleep in the lamplight. The boy's chest rose and fell steadily now, his fever-flushed cheeks returning to their normal color. Looking at him, Grady realized with sudden clarity that this child had become the center of his world. Somehow, in the space of a few weeks, Samuel had worked his way into Grady's heart, filling an emptiness he hadn't even known was there. Reverend Taylor checked on them one last time before retiring. "Rest easy," he assured them. "I'll keep watch tonight. God has preserved this child's life through your courage. Now it's my turn to stand guard." Morning sunlight streamed through the parsonage windows as Reverend Taylor hurried up the stairs, his footsteps quick with excitement. In his hand, he clutched a telegram that had just arrived by Ryder from Fort Garland. "Naichi," he called softly, finding her feeding Samuel near the window. "The Army has responded to my inquiries." Grady stood from where he'd been mending his coat, moving closer as the preacher unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. His eyes scanned the message, and a broad smile spread across his weathered face. It's here. All of it. The Army records confirm everything. Corporal James Avery filed marriage documents before his death. They have your union listed in their official records, dated and witnessed. Naichi's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Samuel cooed softly in her arms, unaware of the momentous news. "If you'll permit me," Reverend Taylor said, "I'd like to read this to the town. They need to hear the truth." Within the hour, townsfolk gathered in the churchyard, drawn by the ringing of the church bell. Some came willingly, others with reluctance etched on their faces. Grady positioned himself protectively near Naichi as she stood on the church steps, holding Samuel high enough for all to see. Reverend Taylor's voice carried clearly across the yard as he read the telegram. "This document confirms the legal marriage of Corporal James Avery to Naichi, performed with full military recognition at Fort Garland on April 15, 1872. Their union was witnessed by Captain Thomas Morton and Chaplain William Reed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several men who had been loudest in their accusations now stared at their boots, shame coloring their faces. "This child," the preacher continued, gesturing to Samuel, "is the legitimate son of a United States Army corporal who gave his life in service. Those who accused his mother of wrongdoing must now face the truth of their error." One by one, a few townspeople stepped forward. Old Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, removed his hat. "Ma'am, I reckon we owe you an apology," he said gruffly. "We was wrong about you." Others nodded, though some turned away, unable to face their own prejudice. Naichi stood tall, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held Samuel. Her dignity in that moment seemed to touch even the hardest hearts. That evening, Reverend Taylor's wife insisted they join the family for supper. The warm kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread and stew as they gathered around the table. For the first time since finding Naichi in the snow, Grady saw her truly smile, though he noticed how she still held Samuel close, protective even in this moment of victory. As they shared the simple meal, the preacher's kindness wrapped around them like a warm blanket, offering hope that acceptance, though slow in coming, might finally be possible. Over the next 7 days, change crept into town like morning mist. Women from the congregation appeared at the parsonage door, bearing steaming pots of chicken broth and bundles of fresh cloth. They watched, curious and tentative, as Naichi demonstrated her careful stitching technique on Samuel's tiny garments. Grady spent his mornings helping rebuild the church's storm-damaged fence. The steady rhythm of hammer and saw drew approving nods from passing townsmen. Even Deputy Riggs tipped his hat once, though his eyes remained cold. Each evening brought angry mutters from the saloon, where bitter men nursed their grudges over whiskey. But their voices grew fewer as days passed. The preacher's congregation rallied around plans to rebuild Grady's cabin. Men offered timber and labor, while women promised quilts for the new home. Samuel grew pink-cheeked and strong, his cough fading to memory. One evening, as purple twilight settled over the town, Grady and Naichi walked along the quiet street. Their boots crunched on packed snow as they shared whispered dreams of spring gardens and warm hearths. "I reckon I forgot how much I wanted a family," Grady said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Till now." Naichi's smile trembled as tears caught the last light. "Then perhaps God has not forgotten either of us," she whispered. Warm spring winds melted snow into trickling streams as dozens of townspeople gathered to raise Grady's new cabin. The ground, soft from thaw, accepted fresh post holes eagerly. Men grunted as they lifted heavy logs into place while women laid out food on makeshift plank tables. Children darted between workers' legs, shrieking with laughter. Little Samuel, propped in a basket near Naichi, watched with bright eyes as she stirred a pot of venison stew over the outdoor fire. The smell of pine sap and wood shavings filled the air. Grady stood apart, throat tight as he watched walls rise where only ashes had been. Each hammered nail, each fitted board meant his solitary life was ending. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. That evening, as stars pierced the darkening sky, Grady found Naichi sitting alone by the dying cook fire. His heart hammered as he sat beside her. "Will you stay?" he asked quietly. "Not as my guest, but as family." Naichi lifted Samuel from his basket and placed him in Grady's arms. The baby curled trustingly against his chest. "I believe the Creator guided us through snow and fear to find each other," she whispered. "This is where we belong." Lamplight cast gentle shadows across the new cabin's plank walls. The fresh-cut pine still released its sweet scent into the evening air, mixing with wood smoke from the stone hearth. Samuel slept peacefully in the cradle Grady had lovingly carved, his tiny fingers curled around the smooth wooden rail. Naichi stood at the table, running her hands over the coarse wool cloth that had once hidden their precious secret. With reverence, she folded it carefully, each crease precise and deliberate. Her eyes met Grady's across the room. "That night when I begged you not to remove this cloth," she said softly, "I was so afraid. But your disobedience saved us both." She placed the folded fabric on the table like a treasure. "It protected us through the storm, and now it reminds us of hope." Grady moved to stand beside her, his weathered hand touching the cloth. For the first time since his youth, words of prayer came naturally to his lips. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for second chances, for family restored." Through the cabin window they could hear the creek singing its spring song, released from winter's grip. The sound of rushing water promised renewal, like the fresh start they'd found together. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.